The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anush Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping shape it. Welcome back. Hope you're all well. I recently returned from Berlin a couple of weeks ago, where I attended CB Club. It was a really great event. Last year it was in Zurich, but this year it was in Berlin as part of Cannabis Week. Quite a few events going on, starting with Mary Jane the weekend before. CB Club is great. I'm a really big fan of Ben Arn. He's been a previous guest on the show and he really organises really nice, intimate events. He also organises a much bigger event called CB Expo. But yeah, this one was, I guess, 150 people or so. It was great to meet a lot of new and old faces. And there's always a great vibe in Berlin. We ended up in a nice techno club until the small hours, which was much needed. I didn't stick around for ICBC, so not sure how that went, but there was definitely a lot of North Americans in town generally for the week, so I assume they're a bit excited about what might be happening in Germany. Germany has actually released a few initial draft plans for legalization, and we'll be discussing some of those in a show in the upcoming weeks. I'm shortly off on a 6-week mega trip to Australia via Thailand, which I'm very excited about, and my sons are even more excited about. Interesting things happening in the cannabis industries in both those countries, so hopefully we'll get to see some stuff firsthand. I'm hopeful I will be able to release a couple of episodes whilst I'm away, so please do stay tuned. As ever, this show is sponsored by my lovely and very good friends at Lumino. We are talking about cannabis use disorder today, and Lumino have recruited for many science-based roles for businesses across Europe and the rest of the world. Things like chief medical or chief science officers, to name a few. So, as always, if you do need any help with HR or recruitment, please do get in touch with them at luminorecruit.com. And please do mention my name when you do. Now, on with the show. Enjoy. On today's show, we have Will Lorne. Will is a lecturer in the Department of Psychology at King's College London. He researches psychopharmacology, recreational drug use, cannabis, opioid overdose, addiction, and the therapeutic applications of cannabinoids and psychedelics. It's quite a mouthful there, isn't it? Will, welcome. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you very much for having me.
No, real pleasure. Where in the world are you today?
I am sat in my office in King's College London, London Bridge.
There we go. Best place to be for this interview. So I'm really glad we met a few months ago at a kind of event, and I really like the type of stuff that you're working and researching. And so it's great to have you on the show. We're going to talk about cannabis addiction today. But before we go there, it'd be great for us to find out a bit more about you as a person and your background and how and why you got to be studying cannabis.
Yeah, so I did my undergraduate degree at Cambridge in natural sciences, and I started studying all the scary, difficult sciences like physics and chemistry, and I was struggling, and psychology appeared as a route out of that horror show, and I jumped at the opportunity to take a psychology course, and I absolutely loved it. And there were some amazing researchers. There are some amazing researchers and lecturers in psychology, especially researching drug addiction at the University of Cambridge. And two of those people back then were Barry Everett and Trevor Robbins, who had a huge impact on the field of drug addiction research, mainly about using animal models, which, I now don't particularly value, but at the time that was really, really fascinating. And so it was a relief for me to escape the train wreck, which was my attempt at a physics and chemistry degree, to move to psychology, and then the ability to study drugs, psychopharmacology and addiction in an academic sense. That just was a potent combination, and I realized that I actually really liked university again and studying. And I'd always had an interest in drugs and intoxication, and I'd had a fairly typical adolescent period, and so the opportunity to study drugs in an academic light was wonderful. And I was also really, really interested in drug policy and why on earth alcohol, which seemed to cause so many problems every weekend, across cities in the UK, why alcohol was legal while many substances were illegal. I mean, I know that's quite like a simplistic way of looking at it, but that really got me interested in the political side of things as well. And I was like, okay, well, I know that I really want to spend my time researching this. I've now got a degree in psychology, and I ended up doing a PhD with Professor Val Curran and Professor Celia Morgan at University College London in psychopharmacology, specifically investigating reward processing in nicotine and cannabis use disorders. So I did start originally working on kind of theories of drug addiction, kind of at a neurobiological and also psychological level. And then after doing my PhD, I moved on to some postdoc positions. So that's just further research. And I worked on a clinical trial investigating whether ketamine could be an effective treatment for alcohol use disorder. That was with Celia Morgan, who is the principal investigator, and that's now booming with the Awaken clinics taking off, and her phase 3 trial, which is about to be rolled out across 7 sites across the UK. So that was a really amazing experience to work on that study, and I'm so pleased to see it do so well now moving forward. And then I worked on another postdoc position with Val, which is all about the short and long-term effects of cannabis and cannabinoids in teenagers in comparison to adults, with the general hypothesis that maybe teenagers might be more vulnerable to some of the potentially harmful effects of cannabis. Another short postdoc at King's with Professor Sir John Strang about opioid overdose, and then I took this lectureship at King's, having my kind of dream job of teaching people about psychopharmacology and addiction whilst also maintaining my research interests. So kind of in sum, I've always had a strong interest in the way that recreational drugs affect the human mind and behavior and can create pleasure and problems. And when psychology offered an opportunity to research that academically and give me a career, it was a no-brainer, really.
Fantastic. Great story. And that latter piece of research is what we're going to be discussing in a bit. Very interesting that you were drawn to psychology, rather than the hard science side of things. But I assume that the chemistry and the physics have been a bit useful in your studies as well.
Definitely not the physics. No, I wish I'd never bothered with that at all. I mean, maybe the chemistry sometimes, but I think and it's an interesting question, is the kind of how far do you try to reduce one science to the kind of underlying science? So like something I have a bit of an issue with is biological reductionism, which is very common in psychopathology research, where you're interested in why do people have depression? And lots of people like to immediately reduce that all to genetics, brain dysfunction. And so you could go a step further and start thinking, oh, let's try to reduce that down to organic chemistry, but that would be ridiculous. So no, I would say that actually it would have been far better if I'd just started studying psychology from day one. But no, it's nice to have a broad understanding of different sciences.
Good to know what you don't like, I think, in life. And the drug policy interest that kind of underpins a lot of the stuff that we're looking at. And that's kind of that's more a kind of the humanities, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I never got to a point where I was kind of academically expert in that, but I like the way that science can actually inform policy, and obviously it plays a big role in drug policy. We need to know what the harms are, what the benefits are, who experiences the harms, who experiences the benefits, how we maximize the benefits and reduce the harm. So that intersection between science and policy is a fascinating space for me. And it was definitely a way when I was in my very early 20s, that was a way that I was able to kind of express my enthusiasm by getting involved in a few kind of policy organizations and doing a few kind of extra things, that gave kind of color and meaning to the academic studies that I think really encouraged me to continue with passion moving forward.
Yeah, I like that. That's very good. And look, like I said, we're going to talk about this piece of research that you released in February, I believe, in a minute in relation to cannabis addiction. But is there any other what are some of the other projects that you're involved in at King's at the moment?
So one of the really different and interesting projects I've been involved with over the last year and a half is a piece of work investigating whether we might be able to use devices that measure breathing rate or blood oxygen to perhaps detect opioid overdose for people who are using alone, or maybe just aren't noticed even if they're with people, so that that detection could then alert a friend or the emergency services to come and rescue them with naloxone. So doing some really interesting experimental work and lab-based work, as well as kind of qualitative and observational studies to investigate the effectiveness of these devices, as well as like the acceptability with people that do use heroin or other opioids. And that's been a really interesting project, and that's still, moving forward. And there's a few groups around the world which are investigating these new mobile health technologies for that purpose. So that's a really exciting project. And shout out to Bashak Tash, who's the postdoc who leads that, along with Professor John Strang. And then my main kind of piece of work that's been rumbling along over the last few years, not just about cannabis use disorder or addiction, but as I mentioned, is this kind of like general investigation into adolescence and how does cannabis use impact natural development. And something that I'm hoping to do in the future is push the age back a little bit earlier, investigate, do some studies with teenagers who are maybe 13 or 14 who use cannabis, and investigate what the reasons are and what the outcomes of that might be. That, of course, requires parental consent and a lot of safeguarding, and so comes with huge amounts of care and consideration and rightly, ethical approvals, blah, blah, blah. So haven't yet started that project, but that's something I'm hoping to investigate in the future.
Yeah, I'm sure that'd be really simple to do. Mate, that's fantastic. I'm really glad that you're looking at those other things. So let's get on to the main topic, which is to be talking about cannabis addiction. And amongst lots of your different research, you'll have a great viewpoint on that. I always like to start with a bit of a kind of, some definitions, if you like. What is addiction from a, I guess, clinical sense?
So it's a really interesting question, and there probably isn't, consensus or full agreement on this. The DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is used to diagnose all kind of psychiatric and behavioral disorders, uses 11 symptoms, which include things like craving, trying to cut down but failing, or trying to stop but failing, having relationship problems as a result of drug use, struggling at work or school because of drug use, using more than you originally set out to on a session of use. So they've got these list of symptoms, and the DSM basically says if you've got 6 or more of those in the past 12 months, then you have a severe substance use disorder. And what that means kind of in lay language is like your drug use is causing you significant distress and disruption to your life. And in terms of like what that means for the person, they may well, most people actually with a substance use disorder don't seek treatment. They may well not think that they need it. They also potentially might not need it. So I mean, you could have a mild substance use disorder which involves 2 of those symptoms of 11. You could imagine having some cravings, and also perhaps you're doing a few of your old hobbies less. You could argue, a mild substance use disorder may well not need substantial intervention. So we should be thinking about addiction kind of as a spectrum. So I think of addiction really, I tend not to use that word so much, but more use the phrase substance use disorder or problematic drug use, where at one end of the spectrum, your life is unfortunately, in very, very serious, you've got very serious problems. You're experiencing major disruption to your life, to your relationships, to your ability to do other things. And then at the other end of the spectrum, in kind of a hazardous use of a drug, which I'd still kind of put on that spectrum, you might binge drink, you might make a fool of yourself regularly, and your friends might tell you, oh, you were a bit of an idiot last night, like, why did you say that thing to your mate, blah, blah, blah. And like that might be happening, let's say weekly, but like in the week, you're not drinking, and we're not drinking very much. Now, I view those things on the same continuous spectrum and you can continue to drink. Let's take alcohol as an example. You can continue to drink more and more and have more and more of these problems until you get to a point where like your life almost revolves around it. So yeah, so spectrum based. Now other people view it kind of differently, and they highlight key psychological criteria or key like kind of hallmark issues. So one would be compulsive drug use, which basically means people have very limited control. Their agency or their autonomy is either nil or incredibly impaired. Now, personally, I think that very rarely happens, and it might happen while people are in a kind of big binge session. But actually, when you look at the research, even very heavily addicted or people with severe substance use disorders still report ability to the desire to continue to use drugs at points, the ability to stop at points. And actually, I think it doesn't do anyone any favors to just say people who have addiction are basically kind of automatons who have lost agency. That does not mean that people should be blamed, but what it does mean is that actually there's hope. If you want to make changes, you can do that with support. It's not all is not lost. The other thing that people tend to highlight, which I like, is, and there's a researcher called Nick Heather who's promoted this idea, which is that addiction should be characterized by the inability to the repeated inability to refrain when you want to. So he thinks that gets to the heart of what problem drug use is, basically saying to yourself, this week I'm not going to use, and then you end up doing it. But clinically, really the best way to think about it is a spectrum-based disorder, like many other mental disorders or behavioral disorders, which is diagnosed using a set of symptoms, and that basically means your life is disrupted by your relationship with the drug.
Yeah, fascinating discussion. We could probably have the whole podcast about just the discussion around what that means. I mean, I like that, the spectrum approach and the problematic, using problematic as part of the definition is quite a good way to set it apart. Obviously, different substances as well carry different risks. So, the very physically addictive ones like heroin and crack and methamphetamine, I guess that takes on a more of a inability to refrain type aspects to it than possibly other ones. But, alcohol, for example, is probably the most pervasive in our society. I think if you drink alcohol regularly in a social arena, it's quite difficult to refrain. And, would you class that as an addiction because you're not, able to do it? But anyway, that's a discussion for another time, but really useful to understand some of those different viewpoints on it. So maybe we can now talk about, what does cannabis addiction look like as distinct from some of the general themes that you just brought up?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to couch this within a discussion about addiction of other drugs as well. And you raise other drugs. And the first thing I'll say is that the vast majority of people who use cannabis do not develop a cannabis use disorder. They don't develop problem cannabis use. That's also true of all other recreational drugs, even more addictive drugs like heroin, like methamphetamine, like alcohol. It's difficult to get the exact number right, and it probably changes country to country and over time, but about 10% of people who ever try cannabis will likely end up with a moderate to severe cannabis use disorder. What does someone with cannabis use disorder present with? All of the things that I talked about before, but of course, doesn't pose physical risks immediately to your health. You can't die from a cannabis overdose, whereas you can die from an alcohol overdose, a benzodiazepine overdose, or a heroin overdose. So that's a crucial distinction if we're comparing someone with a cannabis use disorder to a heroin use disorder or an alcohol use disorder. The actual physical risk that person is putting themselves in, in the moment, is much less for a cannabis use disorder than, say, a heroin use disorder. Now, I want to avoid sort of stereotypes and cliches. When we think of people with substance use disorders, because everyone is different and anyone can end up having a use disorder with a certain drug, although there are vulnerability factors. But, so when you say, what does cannabis use disorder look like? Well, It might look like starting to use cannabis when you wake up. It might look like having kind of brain fog throughout the day. It might look like not quite having the energy to, do the things that you want to, or it might involve perhaps reducing the time that you spend doing the other things that you previously enjoyed doing. Smoking 5 grams on a day rather than like half a gram like you used to. I mean, they are kind of common across other substance use disorders as well. There's nothing which, the same criteria are used to diagnose a cannabis use disorder as a alcohol use disorder, but like many of those things are, you'll get a different distribution, I guess. Like, for instance, cannabis withdrawal, which does exist for people who use every day and use a lot, but the withdrawal syndrome is much kind of weaker or milder than an alcohol withdrawal syndrome, which can put you into a seizure. So yeah, I mean, do you have any kind of more, did I answer your question, or I feel like maybe I haven't?
No, it's good to have that context. And I think you make a really good statement at the beginning where you talk about the fact, and I think this is where the drugs debate gets very clouded as well, that, most people do take substances without issue or with minimal issues, let's say, in the same way that if you say, so if someone drinks alcohol, they're not just a violent alcoholic, and that shouldn't be the characterization of anyone that uses drugs either. So it's really useful to have that context. Also useful to understand that, that some of the hallmarks of cannabis use disorder are just in common with all substance use disorders.
Yeah. And I also just want to make the point which you just made there, really highlight it, is it can be really damaging and negative for society and people with substance use disorders to have these categorical labels of alcoholic, or even worse, addict, or, encouraging a problem-based, spectrum-based approach to this allows us all to reflect on our substance use and the relationships that we have with substances. And it also allows people who have more severe problems to say, okay, I might have quite a difficult relationship with cannabis and I should probably take action on that. Often there might be a level of unwillingness to identify as, for instance, an alcoholic, and using alcohol as the example there, and that might prevent people from taking constructive step to address minor problems, as well as causing incredible stigma towards that person. So that's another reason why it's really helpful not to have these kind of categorical labels.
Absolutely. And you make a really valid point, because the label of addict is unhelpful. And yes, cannabis use disorder, it's always, when you're in parenting, when your child is acting up, the advice is always to focus in on the behavior rather than them. So not to label them as a bad child, but the behavior is bad or is problematic in the same way. So that does make a lot of sense. And you mentioned the withdrawal symptoms. What are they? You said they're mild and they don't last as long as something like alcohol, for example. But what are some of the withdrawal symptoms?
So it's quite similar to a nicotine withdrawal. And especially if you smoke cannabis with tobacco, you're also going to have nicotine withdrawal if you stop. But they look like irritability, sleep problems, and sometimes some kind of shakiness, strange dreams, and anxiety, those kind of psychological symptoms. So that's what it looks like. And it tends to last about kind of 3 to 7 days. THC, the compound which gets you high, has quite a long half-life, and so do its metabolites, and it's lipophilic, so it's getting into your fat cells in your body, so it takes quite a while for your body to totally eliminate it, which is one of the reasons why the withdrawal syndrome kind of take a few days to come on and a few days to stop. And actually what's really interesting is that there have been some PET studies, so that's positron emission tomography, that looks at the number of CB1 receptors in your brain. And if you smoke or use a lot of cannabis, the density of those receptors is down-regulated, so you have many fewer in comparison to someone who doesn't regularly use cannabis. But what happens over the month when you stop is they totally normalize back to the level of a non-user. And so again, that's another way to think about this, the kind of the biological underpinnings. I know I said I didn't like biological reductionism, but with a withdrawal syndrome, it is quite clearly biological. So you can see how the changes in the CB1 receptors are associated with this withdrawal syndrome, because you're taking away the constant THC partial agonism, and you're leaving the down-regulated CB1 receptors.
Yeah, fascinating. So kind of moving on and looking at cannabis use disorder from a a treatment perspective, how can it be treated? Is it simply cessation, or is there anything more to it?
Okay, so it would very much depend on what the patient desired, right? So, first thing to say, most people who want to treat their problem with cannabis, if they have one, is that they tend to treat it themselves. Actually, the vast majority of people with cannabis use disorder, cannabis problem, say to themselves, I'm going to reduce and I'm going to implement various strategies which I've kind of just learned along the way through life. I won't hang out with my mate Ben for the first few weeks. I'm going to go to the gym more. That's actually the way that most people recover or improve in that situation. If you do seek treatment, so let's say I go to my local drug service, which will see me on, the local authority drug service for free. If I say I have a, cannabis problem and I want to quit or I want to reduce, then they will assess me, ask me what my goals are. And they might be to stop, they might be to massively reduce. They might also be kind of harm reduction where I want to stop smoking tobacco. So once they've assessed what my goals are, they would, at the moment, provide a brief intervention of psychosocial interventions, which would be a kind of combination of what we call motivational interviewing, where the therapist is encouraging me to elicit my motivation to stop or to continue reducing, that they'll talk to me about what I want and how I'm going to achieve it and basically kind of be the facilitator. They'll also use some cognitive behavioral strategies. So why do you use? What are the high risk situations? Let's think of coping strategies. Let's avoid the places where you're at most at risk of using if you want to stop. And that might go on typically only for about 4 weeks, and then you're just left on your own again. Now, you could pay privately and you could kind of go to a residential rehab and they could support you for a month. But again, it's not going to be longer than that. And you could, of course, go private and have a long-term therapist who sees you once a week and continues to use those kind of strategies. What's disappointing is that we don't have any pharmacological treatments currently for cannabis use disorder, which we do have for alcohol use disorder, which we do have for opioid use disorder. And there are some pharmacotherapies in the works which look really promising, including high dose oral cannabidiol, FAR inhibitors, which basically increase your levels of anandamide by reducing the breakdown of anandamide. And also, I think there's still promise in basically maintenance replacement, so giving people oral THC as dronabinol. That's shown mixed findings, but I think that there's definitely some kind of therapeutic signal there. So I reckon in 10 years, if we're having this conversation, there will be drugs to help people if they want to reduce or stop using cannabis. But at the moment, it's primarily psychosocial treatments or just people doing it on their wands.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much I could go into there, but very interesting that it's sort of the psychological and the lifestyle changes that are kind of driving it. And very ironically, I suppose, that you're looking at using another part of the cannabis plant to help you cure addiction. But if I'm going to draw in one point, how much of this is linked to tobacco? So smoking is obviously the predominant method of administration for most users of cannabis. And I get in North America, this is less of an issue because they don't use tobacco, but in Europe, certainly tobacco is how people smoke with. And that's obviously got its own addictive qualities to it. So how do you unpick all of that mess?
Yeah, and it is a mess. So we did some research at UCL, well, my colleagues did, and looking at kind of tobacco use as a predictor of cannabis dependence, and showed that association does exist. So it does, your level of tobacco use disorder is predictive of difficulties with cannabis if you're co-consuming. There's of course going to be a sort of common liability factor. If you're the kind of person who ends up with a problem with tobacco, you might also be the kind of person who ends up with a problem with cannabis, just because the kind of vulnerability factors are similar. But kind of number one harm reduction advice for cannabis use is, if possible, try to avoid tobacco at all, because we know that that has really awful physical health consequences that don't need to go into. Everyone's aware of them. So like that's actually, I recently spoke to a drug service worker, and he was like, that's a very, very typical kind of first session bit of treatment, is like, for your own physical health, let's try to help you consume cannabis without tobacco. So let's start vaping, let's start, can you use edibles, etc. And yeah, in terms of actually your success of quitting, if you want to quit, if you're smoking joints with a mixture of tobacco and cannabis, it's it's a double whammy, isn't it? Like, you are essentially giving up two potentially addictive drugs at the same time. And yeah, the data really does bear that out. Like, it's harder to give up cannabis and tobacco at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, anyone that's been a smoker knows how hard it is to give up cigarettes alone. So yeah, the combination, I can imagine, is difficult. But it's interesting that moving people onto something that doesn't involve tobacco is a useful first step.
And also, that can be an effective first step, because once you've used a drug for a long time or done anything for a long time, you think about the rhythms that you get into, potentially the habits, and breaking those regular routines often gives you kind of slightly more awareness and mindfulness of what you're doing as a kind of agent in the world. So like, if you move from constantly just rolling and smoking joints with tobacco and cannabis, and you're like, okay, now I'm going to vape, it becomes slightly more goal directed and slightly more conscious perhaps. And so not only have you cut out tobacco, you've also started to be more mindful of the process of drug consumption. And that's an incredibly positive thing, to focus on what you're doing, why you're doing it, assessing the pros and cons.
Yeah, absolutely. Really valuable advice there. Very touching quickly on the bit of research you did around CBD. And there's been different bits of research to talk about this. And so I wondered, just without going into too much detail, but your general view, because, the sort of old received wisdom was that CBD kind of balance, and I'm really going to butcher this in terms of scientific language here, but sort of tempers THC in some way. Your research, maybe you could talk a bit about what you found, but also there's some conflicting research in relation to this as well. What's your sort of broad general view as well?
Yeah, so thinking first just purely about how CBD works in the brain. So we don't really know exactly. It's thought to be an allosteric modulator at the CB1 receptor, which could potentially alter the way that THC binds to the CB1 receptor. And it also might increase anandamide levels or bind to other dopamine or serotonin receptors. So it's got quite a dirty, mixed pharmacological profile. Previously, like you said, people thought that CBD might alter the short-term experiences of consuming THC. So perhaps a cannabis strain with higher levels of CBD might give you a kind of, I don't know, more relaxed or calmer or less anxious high. In fact, over the last few years, a lot of experimental work, including my own, which we just published in Journal of Addiction earlier this year, and Amir England's work published in Neuropsychopharmacology, showed that CBD didn't alter any of the psychological subjective effects of THC. Now, it may well be that over the long term, if you were consuming high dose oral CBD for, I don't know, if you were taking Epidiolex for some reason, that could over the long term alter the way that your body interacts with THC, or THC interacts with your body. But that's a very unusual scenario. That, I mean, you can't really imagine that happening very much in the real world. At the levels of CBD and THC that naturally occur in cannabis, I would be confident to say that I don't think CBD has a noticeable impact on the subjective experience. But at higher doses, artificially given, or over a longer period of time, that's definitely still yet to be seen what those impacts are. But I think, trying it back to addiction, we've been interested in whether consuming different types of cannabis might be potentially safer or less likely to facilitate progression to addiction. And what Tom Freeman's research has shown is that consumption of hash. I mean, this was from a few years ago when hash was actually considerably weaker in terms of its THC concentration, because we know that that's really surged recently over the last 5 years in Europe. But smoking hash or smoking outdoor grown imported cannabis, which has much lower THC concentration than Sensimilla or whatever you want to call it, high grade skunk, basically lower potency cannabis, is much less likely to promote a transition to cannabis use disorder. So basically, another bit of harm reduction advice is potentially, if you're happy to, use lower potency cannabis, including hash. And one of the reasons that people used to think that might be beneficial is that perhaps the chronic administration of CBD, which tends to be much higher in hash than flower cannabis, that chronic administration might be protective of addiction problems later down the line.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it just kind of shows us how much research needs to happen, right? And how we're kind of only just starting really to learn more. I mean, obviously there is a body of research, but so much more that could and should happen in order to investigate lots of these aspects. So as we come towards the end, one of the conversations that you and I had when we met was around, generally research seems to be focused around harm reduction, and not enough is sort of looked at from the lens of the positives that a lot of these things give, whether it be, appreciation of music, a bit more confidence, some creativity. There's lots of aspects in that. I mean, there's a reason why people use recreational drugs, and it is, it's for enjoyment, and there's something that it gives them that they don't get from other things. It's a really open question here, but what's your view on that, and generally where you'd like research to focus on if you had a magic wand?
Wow, that's an exciting magic wand to have in my control. Yeah, I mean, well, I think it's always really kind of frustrated me that we kind of, as researchers, sort of have to constantly be talking about the harms of the drugs. And that comes from a place of like the government research councils that fund research are obviously much more interested in kind of reducing harm at a public health level, and that's understandable because those research councils are funded by the taxpayer, and we want research that keeps people healthy and develops medicines, etc. And trying to, how do we reconcile that drive within academia to talk about harms with just the elephant in the room and the knowledge from looking around and personal experience that people take a huge amount of pleasure from altered states of consciousness. Now, that ranges all the way from a life-changing psychedelic experience to a nice drink down the pub with your friends. Like, something that really kind of gets my goat is that we are constantly trying to quantify total harm done to society by a drug, and also thinking about the tax paid by, let's say, the alcohol industry. That's obviously a benefit for the government and public purse, but the reason people, for instance, one of the reasons people have a drink, taking alcohol as an example, is because they enjoy it. It allows them to relax, it allows them to open up, it allows them to connect with people. And I think it's to our detriment that when we talk about recreational drugs, we forget that that's an absolutely, I mean, that is the fundamental reason why they exist, for both pleasure, relaxation, personal growth. But I also don't like the fact that people who, let's say, evangelical psychedelic users might view alcohol consumption as evil, and people who drink alcohol view cannabis use as ridiculous and bad. These are most people can use recreational drugs safely and without harm, and they have done for hundreds or thousands of years, depending on what drugs they are. Our job as researchers and policymakers and podcasters should be to ensure that people get the best information about how to use these things safely, and also to direct people that might be really vulnerable to harms potentially away from them. But we have to keep in the center of our minds the fact that this is the reason people take drugs, is that they give pleasure, and it's almost a kind of fundamental human right to do what you want with your own body, so long as you're not harming other people or harming yourself to an extent that harms other people. And I do wish that that was kept in mind slightly more when kind of judgmental academics talked about it.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a show on its own we could do, but I couldn't agree with you more in terms of the way people approach this. I've certainly spoken to a lot of the cannabis community who do, I think, in a way to kind of sort of legitimize cannabis in a way, find alcohol to be a convenient like opponent or bad guy. And the reality is most people enjoy lots of these different things together. It's the same way as like judging someone because I drink wine and I don't drink beer, and, you know, like it's kind of viewing them from differently there. But I think this is a kind of societal issue in terms of harm reduction. Everything's seen as potential harm now. There's some other things that I've been looking at, and, you know, in certain schools, physical touch has been banned completely because it's potential harm. And in certain workplaces in the US, you're not allowed to look at people in the eye for longer than 15 seconds because that could be potential harmful and putting them in a difficult position. And it's now we're just sort of losing humanity because everyone's seen as an offender. Then, you know, we're going to stop congregating and procreating. But anyway, this is a much bigger discussion. Will, this has been really, really fascinating. And thank you so much for sharing your time. We'd love to get you back on at some point to talk more about some more of your work. So you're always welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise. Take care. Thanks again for listening. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please subscribe, rate, review, and share the podcast. It will help me spread the good word on how this amazing industry is developing. I'm a commercial lawyer and I work with a number of cannabis businesses in the UK. If you need help with commercial contracts, data protection, employment, corporate, or other business legal needs, please do get in touch with me via LinkedIn or at anuj@canvas.global.